Crime Tales, Episode 2, Belle Starr, the Bandit Queen. February 3rd, 1889. Oklahoma Indian Territory, 2 days before her 41st birthday. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. A woman rides alone on a dusty road, her black velvet skirt flowing elegantly over her side saddle. At her hips, 2 pearl-handled pistols rest in their holsters, weapons she affectionately calls her babies. She's just left a neighbor's house and is heading home to her ranch at a place called Younger's Bend. The evening is peaceful, quiet. She has no idea these are the final moments of her life. 2 shotgun blasts shatter the evening silence. The woman is thrown from her horse, landing hard on the Oklahoma soil. Blood pools beneath her. But the killer isn't finished. They approach the wounded woman lying on the ground and fire again, point blank. Just to make absolutely certain she's dead. Her name was Belle Starr. The newspapers called her the Bandit Queen, the female Jesse James, the petticoat terror of the plains. According to legend, she was a ruthless criminal mastermind who led gangs of desperados, robbed banks and stagecoaches, and ruled a criminal empire from her fortress in the Cherokee Nation. Publishers turned her into a dime novel sensation. Hollywood made her a movie star. For over a century, she's been remembered as the most dangerous woman in the Wild West. But here's what'll keep you with me for the next 2 hours. Almost everything you think you know about Belle Starr is a complete fabrication. The real Belle Starr was convicted of exactly 1 crime in her entire life. 1. And it wasn't murder. It wasn't bank robbery. It wasn't even armed robbery. It was horse theft. So who was she really? Who created this elaborate myth? Why? And how did a relatively minor horse thief become one of the most famous outlaws in American history? Today, we're diving deep into one of the greatest cases of historical fiction passing as fact. We're separating truth from legend. And I promise you, the real story is far more fascinating than anything Hollywood invented. Hello, friends, and welcome to Crime Tales, the podcast where we dig beneath the headlines and uncover the real stories behind history's most fascinating criminal cases. I'm your host, and I am thrilled you're here with me today. Now, I have a confession to make. When I first started researching Belle Starr for this episode, I thought I knew her story. You know, the famous female outlaw, the woman who rode with Jesse James, who led a gang of bandits, who had shootouts with marshals across the frontier. That's what I'd seen in old Western movies, right? Turns out I was completely wrong. And honestly, I'm so glad I was. Because the real Belle Starr, the woman behind the myth, is so much more interesting than the Hollywood version. Her story is going to make you think differently about women in the Old West, about how legends are created, about the power of media sensationalism, and about how sometimes the myth becomes more powerful than the truth. And here's what really got me hooked as I dug into this story. Belle Starr's myth wasn't created by accident. It was deliberately manufactured by a savvy publisher who saw dollar signs in her tragic death. Within months of her murder, a sensational biography hit the streets, filled with outrageous lies and completely invented adventures. And those lies, they stuck for over 100 years. Over the next 2 hours, we're going on a journey together. We're traveling back to 1848 to a prosperous Missouri farm where a little girl named Myra Maybelle Shirley is born, not into poverty, not into crime, but into a well-to-do family. We'll follow her through the chaos of the Civil War, through 3 marriages to outlaws, through the only crime she was ever actually convicted of, and finally to that lonely road where her life ended in violence. But we're also going to do something else. We're going to watch how a myth gets built, how a publisher named Richard K. Fox turned a relatively obscure woman into a national sensation, how the FBI and Hollywood kept that myth alive for decades, and how modern historians are finally setting the record straight. So whether you're folding laundry, cooking dinner, driving to pick up the kids, or just relaxing with a cup of coffee, Settle in. Get comfortable, because this is going to be a wild ride through the Old West, through murder and mystery, through truth and lies. And I promise you'll never look at Western movies the same way again. Before we dive in, just a quick note. This episode contains discussions of violence, including murder, domestic situations, and some difficult themes. Nothing graphic, but I want you to be aware. All right, friends, let's head back to Missouri in 1848 and meet a little girl who would become the most mythologized woman in the Wild West. Part 1. The Making of Myra. Maybelle childhood in the Civil War years. Here's where we start dismantling the myths right from the very beginning. Because Belle Starr's origin story, the real one, is nothing like what you'd expect from a Wild West outlaw. Picture this. It's February 5th, 1848. On a farm near Carthage, Missouri, in Jasper County, a baby girl is born to John and Elizabeth Shirley. They name her Myra Maybelle Shirley. Her family calls her May. And this is important, really important. She's not born into some desperate, poverty-stricken situation. She's not born into crime. She's born into comfort. Now, in all those dime novels and movies about Belle Starr, she's usually portrayed as coming from a rough, hardscrabble background. You know the story? Poor family, desperate circumstances, forced into crime to survive. That's the typical origin story for outlaws, right? It makes sense. It's sympathetic, except that's not what happened at all. Not even close. The Shirleys were actually quite well off. John Shirley was a successful farmer who raised wheat, corn, hogs, and horses. He was good at it. The family prospered. And here's an interesting detail that tells you something about Belle's family background. John Shirley was considered the black sheep of a well-to-do Virginia family. He'd moved west to Indiana, and here's the scandalous part. He'd been married and divorced not once, but twice before marrying Belle's mother. In the 1840s, that was really scandalous. Divorce was rare. It carried a serious social stigma. People didn't just get divorced casually back then. So Belle's father was already someone who didn't quite fit the mold, someone who'd broken with convention. Keep that in mind. It might be where Belle got some of her independent streak. Belle's mother, Elizabeth, went by Eliza. And get this, she was related to the Hatfields. Yes, those Hatfields from the famous Hatfield-McCoy feud. So Belle had some pretty colorful family connections even before she was born. Violence and family feuds were part of her heritage. The Shirleys did well for themselves in Missouri. They prospered. And by 1856, when Belle was 8 years old, her father had done so well that he sold their farm and moved the family into the town of Carthage itself. And he didn't just buy a house in town. He built a business empire. John Shirley built an inn, a tavern, a livery stable, and a blacksmith shop. And these businesses, they took up almost an entire city block in downtown Carthage. The Shirleys were becoming pillars of the community. They were successful, respectable. This was a family on the rise, not a family struggling on the margins. And here's another major myth we need to bust right away. Belle Starr wasn't some illiterate, rough and tumble outlaw who grew up wild and untamed on the frontier. She was educated, really, truly educated. And not just in a basic way. Belle attended the Carthage Female Academy. Let me say that again because it's important. A private academy for young ladies. Think about what that means. This wasn't a one-room schoolhouse. This wasn't basic frontier education. This was an exclusive private school that her father had actually helped to found. The Shirleys had the money and the social standing to send their daughter to one of the finest schools in the region. At the Carthage Female Academy, Belle learned to play the piano. And I don't mean she just plunked out a few tunes. She became quite accomplished at it. She studied the classics, literature, history, the things that proper young ladies were supposed to know. She learned to read and write well, which was not a given for girls at that time, even in good families. Belle was being groomed to be a proper Southern lady, someone who could move in respectable society, someone who could entertain guests with piano music, someone who would make a good match with a merchant or a lawyer, or maybe even a politician. That was the future that seemed laid out for her. Now, she did have another side to her education, and this is where the reality of frontier life comes in. Her older brother, John Allison Shirley, everyone called him Bud, he taught Belle things that weren't on the curriculum at the Female Academy. He taught her to ride horses. And not just ride, but to ride well, like a frontier woman who could handle herself in rough country. Bud also taught Belle to shoot. She learned to handle firearms, and she became an excellent markswoman. Now, this wasn't as unusual as you might think. Frontier families often taught their daughters to shoot because you never knew when you might need to defend the homestead. But combined with her other skills, it meant Belle was unusual. So picture young Belle Shirley at age 14 or 15. She can play classical piano beautifully. She's had a fine education. She can discuss literature and history. She can move in polite society. And she can outride and outshoot most of the boys in Carthage. She's living a comfortable life in a prosperous family. Her future looks bright, secure, respectable. She'll probably marry well, have children, be a respected member of her community. And then the Civil War tears everything apart. Friends, to really understand what happened to Belle Starr, to understand how Myra Maybelle Shirley became Belle Starr, we have to understand what the Civil War did to Missouri. And Missouri's experience in the Civil War was particularly brutal. Missouri was what they called a border state. It stayed officially in the Union, but thousands and thousands of Missourians supported the Confederacy. Families were divided. Neighbors became enemies. Brother fought against brother. And it wasn't just armies in uniforms fighting the set-piece battles. It was guerrilla warfare, brutal, personal, vicious, with no rules. The Shirley family were Confederate sympathizers, strong ones. John Shirley supported the Confederate cause, and in the Kansas-Missouri border region, that made you a target. Because this area, the Kansas-Missouri border, this was where some of the worst violence of the entire Civil War took place. Belle's brother Bud, the one who taught her to ride and shoot, he joined a group of Confederate guerrillas. They were called Quantrill's Raiders, named after their leader, William Quantrill. Now, if you know anything about the Civil War in this region, that name should send chills down your spine. Quantrill's Raiders weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were guerrilla fighters who operated outside the normal rules of war. They conducted raids, ambushes, and brutal reprisals against Union supporters. And the violence went both ways. Union forces and Union guerrillas did the same things to Confederate sympathizers. It was neighbor killing neighbor, house burnings, executions without trial, massacres. The Kansas-Missouri border region during the Civil War was essentially a war zone where the normal rules of civilization had completely broken down. People who'd been neighbors for years were suddenly mortal enemies. Towns were burned. Families were driven from their homes. And in this chaos, a young girl was watching her world fall apart. In 1864, something happened that would mark Belle forever. Her brother Bud was killed. Now, different sources give slightly different accounts of exactly how it happened. Some say he died in a skirmish with Union forces. Others say he was killed in a battle somewhere in Missouri. The details are murky because record-keeping during guerrilla warfare was spotty at best. What we know for certain is that Bud Shirley died. He was only in his early 20s, and for Belle, this was devastating. Bud had been her older brother, her teacher, probably her hero. He'd taught her to ride and shoot. He'd represented adventure and excitement, and now he was gone, killed in this brutal, senseless conflict that was tearing Missouri apart. Now, later biographers, especially that publisher Richard K. Fox I mentioned, they would claim that Bud's death turned Belle into an outlaw bent on revenge. They created this whole dramatic narrative where teenage Belle swore vengeance against the Union and became a Confederate spy, or even a guerrilla fighter herself. One popular story has Belle riding with Quantrill's raiders, carrying messages through enemy lines, even participating in raids. Here's what historians actually know. There is no credible evidence that Belle ever rode with Quantrill's raiders. None. There's no evidence she served as a Confederate spy or agent. None of that is documented anywhere except in sensationalized accounts written after her death. Those stories were invented later to make her seem more dramatic, more dangerous, more exciting. But did Bud's death affect her? Absolutely. How could it not? She'd just lost her older brother to violence. She'd seen how quickly life could be snuffed out. She'd learned that the world was a dangerous place where being on the wrong side could get you killed. That's a harsh lesson for a teenage girl. And then, in 1864, it got even worse. Carthage itself was burned. Now, different historical sources give slightly different accounts of exactly what happened and who was responsible. Both Union and Confederate forces moved through the area. Both sides burned towns and property. What we know for certain is that the result was devastating for the Shirley family. The family inn where Belle had grown up, gone, burned to the ground. The tavern where her father conducted business, gone. The livery stable, gone. The blacksmith shop, all of it reduced to ashes. The center of the Shirley family's prosperity, everything they'd built, was destroyed. And it wasn't just about losing property, as devastating as that was. Carthage wasn't safe anymore for the Shirleys. For a family of known Confederate sympathizers, staying in Carthage meant risking their lives. Both Union and Confederate forces were marauding through the area, and reprisals were common. If you were identified as being on the wrong side, you could be killed. Your property could be confiscated. Your family could be targeted. The Shirleys had to make a choice: stay in Missouri and risk everything, or leave and start over somewhere else. So in 1864, the Shirley family made a decision that would change Belle's life forever. They packed up what little they could salvage, and they left Missouri. They headed south to Texas, to a small settlement called Sign, near Dallas. Belle was 16 years old. Just 16. In the space of 2 years, she'd lost her brother. She'd lost her home. She'd lost the comfortable, prosperous life she'd known. Everything familiar was gone. The future that had seemed so secure, marriage to a respectable man, a comfortable life in Missouri society, all of that had vanished. She was starting over in Texas with a family that had lost almost everything. And in Texas, in Syene, Belle Shirley would meet the men who would tie her forever to the outlaw life. Now here's where Belle's real story starts to overlap with the legend, and where we need to be really careful about separating fact from fiction. In Syene, Texas, in 1866, something happened that is actually documented in multiple sources. The Shirley home became a stop on what was called the Outlaw Trail. And we're not talking about small-time criminals here. We're talking about some of the most famous names in the Wild West: Cole Younger, Jim Younger, Bob Younger, John Younger, and yes, Jesse James himself. These men were former Confederate guerrillas who'd ridden with Quantrill during the war. And after the war ended, they didn't just go home and become farmers. They became outlaws. They were wanted for bank robberies and other crimes. And they used the Shirley home as a hideout, a safe house where they could rest and plan their next moves. Now, was this unusual? Actually, no. It wasn't uncommon at all. Former Confederate families often sheltered former Confederate guerrillas. There was a sense of loyalty, of shared cause, of having fought on the same side during the war. The Shirleys weren't unique in providing shelter to these men. It happened all across the South and border states. But this is where Belle's story gets entangled with legend and where things get really murky. Because later writers, especially that sensationalist publisher Richard K. Fox, would claim that Belle and Cole Younger had this passionate, dramatic romance. They created this whole love story where Belle and Cole were supposedly madly in love, and that her daughter Pearl was actually Cole Younger's illegitimate child, not the child of her actual husband. Cole Younger himself denied this multiple times. He said it never happened. He said he and Belle were never romantically involved, and historians who've studied the timeline and the evidence agree. There's no credible evidence of a romance between Belle and Cole Younger. But facts don't matter when you're building a myth, do they? The story of Belle and Cole was too romantic, too exciting to let facts get in the way. So it became part of the legend, even though it probably wasn't true. What we do know for certain is that Belle met these men. She was exposed to them, spent time around them, and it makes sense that she would have found them exciting. They were young, dashing men with dangerous reputations. They were survivors of the same war that had killed her brother. They represented a kind of freedom, a rejection of the conventional life that had been destroyed for her anyway. And through these men, through the younger brothers and their associates, Belle met a man who would actually become her first husband. His name was Jim Reed. Jim Reed was another former member of Quantrill's Raiders. He'd known the Shirley family back in Missouri before the war, and when he showed up in Texas, he and Belle reconnected. Or maybe connected for the first time as adults. The sources aren't entirely clear. According to some accounts, Belle had had a crush on Reed since she was a teenager. Whether that's true or not, we know what happened next. On November 1st, 1866, 18-year-old Belle Shirley married Jim Reed. Now here's another myth that needs busting because the legend around this marriage is almost as dramatic as the legend around Belle's supposed romance with Cole Younger. The myth says that Belle and Jim Reed were married by another gang member while both of them were on horseback, with outlaws as witnesses, maybe even while fleeing from the law. It's a wonderfully romantic story in an outlaw kind of way. Can't you just picture it? The couple on horseback, guns in their belts, getting married on the run? The truth? According to actual Collin County, Texas marriage records, they had a regular, completely legal, completely normal marriage. The records show that Jim Reed and Miriam Shirley, note the spelling of her first name, were married in a standard ceremony on November 1st, 1866. No horses, no fleeing, just a normal wedding. At first, their married life was actually fairly normal too, at least by frontier standards. Reed moved in with the Shirley family and helped with farm work. Belle and Jim seemed to be trying to build a conventional life. In 1867, Belle got pregnant, and the couple went to live with Reed's mother in Missouri, going back to the state they'd fled from now that the war was over. And on September 1868, Belle gave birth to their first child, a daughter. They named her Rosie Lee, but she'd become known by her nickname, Pearl Shirley Reed, later Pearl Starr. And this is where yet another persistent myth comes in, and I want to address it directly because it's been repeated so many times. For decades, literally decades, people claim that Pearl's father wasn't Jim Reed at all, but was actually Cole Younger, that Belle had secretly had Cole's baby and was passing the child off as her husband's. This rumor has been thoroughly, completely debunked by modern historians. The timeline doesn't work. The evidence doesn't support it. And again, Cole Younger himself denied it. Pearl was Jim Reed's daughter, but the myth was more exciting than the truth, so it hung around for generations, damaging reputations and confusing the historical record. For a while after Pearl's birth, Belle's life was actually fairly domestic. She had a husband, she had a baby daughter. In 1871, they moved to California, where Belle gave birth to a son. They named him James Edwin, but everyone called him Eddie. 2 children, a husband, a somewhat nomadic life as they moved from place to place, but still, on the surface, fairly conventional. But Jim Reed couldn't stay away from crime, and this is where Belle's life starts to take a darker turn. Here's where we need to be really careful about what we attribute to Belle versus what Jim Reed actually did. because this matters for understanding who Belle really was. Jim Reed started getting involved in criminal activity. He stole horses, a serious crime on the frontier where horses could mean the difference between life and death. He associated with cattle rustlers, men who stole livestock for profit, and then he was accused of murder in Arkansas, which forced the family to flee to California to avoid arrest. Now, later accounts, those sensationalized biographies I keep mentioning, they would claim that Belle actively participated in Reed's crimes, that she helped plan robberies, that she was his partner in crime, riding beside him with a gun in her hand, helping hold up stagecoaches, taking her share of the loot, that she was Bonnie to his Clyde, decades before Bonnie and Clyde existed. But here's what historians have actually found. There's very little evidence that Belle actively participated in most of Reed's criminal activities during this period. She knew what he was doing. She must have known. You can't hide that kind of thing from your wife. But knowing about crimes and participating in them are two very different things. However, in 1874, something happened that we know Belle was connected to, at least peripherally. Reed and his gang robbed the Austin San Antonio stagecoach. It was a sensational holdup that made headlines across Texas, and Belle was named in the indictment, not as a participant in the actual robbery, but as an accessory. Someone who helped Reed either before or after the crime, maybe by hiding the stolen money or helping plan the escape route. She was never prosecuted for it. The case against her apparently wasn't strong enough to bring to trial, but her name was now officially in the criminal records. Belle Shirley Reed was associated with a major crime, even if she hadn't pulled the trigger or held the horses during the actual robbery. And then later in 1874, Jim Reed's criminal career came to a violent end. A member of his own gang killed Jim Reed. There are different versions of exactly how it happened. Some accounts say it was during a gunfight after Reed tried to double-cross his partners. Other accounts say Reed was betrayed by someone looking to collect the substantial reward money that was on his head. The details are murky, and we'll probably never know exactly what happened. What we know for certain is that Jim Reed died by violence in 1874, and Belle, at the age of 26, was suddenly a widow with 2 young children to support. Here's a small detail that tells you something important about Belle's character, about her defiance even in difficult circumstances. When authorities asked her to identify Jim Reed's body, she refused. She wouldn't do it. She wouldn't confirm that the dead man was her husband. Why? Some historians say it was because she didn't want the person who killed Reed to be able to collect the reward money. Others say she was just being stubborn, refusing to cooperate with authorities on principle. Either way, it was a small act of defiance that showed Belle wasn't someone who would meekly follow the rules or do what she was told. So there's Belle in late 1874. She's 26 years old. She's a widow. She has 2 small children. Pearl is 6, Eddie is 3. Her husband was a known outlaw, so her own reputation is already damaged. What were her options? In the 1870s, a widow's options were limited. She could try to find another husband quickly, and given her circumstances, that husband probably wouldn't be someone respectable. She could try to support herself through one of the few jobs available to women, maybe taking in laundry, or sewing, or working as a domestic servant. None of those options offered much security or dignity, or she could do what Belle actually did. She left her children with her mother to raise, and then Belle Shirley Reed headed to Indian Territory, what we now call Oklahoma, where the law was weaker, where outlaws could more easily disappear, and where a woman with a damaged reputation might be able to make a new start. It was in Indian Territory that Belle would meet the man who would give her the name that history remembers. It was there that Myra Maybelle Shirley Reed would become Belle Starr. Okay, friends, we're about 25 minutes in, and we've already busted a whole bunch of myths. Belle wasn't born poor. She was born into prosperity. She wasn't uneducated. She went to a private academy. She probably wasn't Cole Younger's lover, and Pearl probably wasn't his child. And there's no solid evidence she was an active criminal during her first marriage, despite all the legends. But all of that is about to change, because Belle is heading into Indian territory where she's about to meet Sam Starr, build a life at Younger's Bend that will make her famous, and commit the one crime she was actually convicted of. Part 2, Belle Starr is born. The Indian Territory years. All right, so Belle arrives in Indian Territory in the mid-1870s. And before we go any further, I need to give you some context about what Indian Territory was like at this time, because it's absolutely crucial to understanding why Belle ended up there, how she survived, and why she was able to get away with certain things for so long. Indian Territory was land that had been set aside by the federal government for Native American tribes. It's what we now call Oklahoma, though the borders and boundaries were different then. The Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole nations had all been forcibly relocated there during the Trail of Tears and other brutal removals in the 1830s and 1840s. This land was supposed to be theirs, to be governed by their own laws and their own systems of justice. But by the 1870s, Indian Territory had also become something else, a haven for outlaws, criminals, and people running from the law. And the reason for that was complicated. It had to do with jurisdiction, with legal authority, with who had the power to arrest and prosecute criminals. See, the legal situation in Indian Territory was a complete mess, a jurisdictional nightmare. Federal marshals had some authority there, but there weren't many of them covering a huge area. The Native American nations had their own courts and laws, but those didn't necessarily apply to white settlers or outlaws who weren't tribal members. State and territorial laws from surrounding areas didn't apply. It was a confusing patchwork of overlapping and conflicting legal systems. And that meant if you were running from the law in Texas or Kansas or Missouri, Indian Territory was a very good place to disappear. You could cross into Indian Territory and suddenly the sheriff or marshal chasing you had no jurisdiction. They couldn't just follow you in and arrest you. They needed special authority, special warrants, and cooperation from other agencies. It was complicated and time-consuming. So Indian Territory became known as a place where outlaws felt relatively safe. Not completely safe. There were federal marshals who operated there, including some legendary ones like Bass Reeves, the first black deputy U.S. Marshal west of the Mississippi, but safer than staying in states where you were actively wanted. Belle Starr understood all of this. She may not have understood all the legal technicalities, but she understood the practical reality. Indian Territory was a place where a woman with a questionable past could start over, where the normal rules didn't quite apply, where she could exist in the spaces between different legal systems. And that's where she went. Now, in Indian Territory, Belle had a few relationships that didn't last long. There was a brief thing with a man named Bruce Younger. Yes, he was related to the Younger brothers we talked about earlier. That relationship didn't last. Then there was involvement with an outlaw who had the wonderfully colorful name of Blue Duck. That sounds like something out of a novel, doesn't it? Blue Duck. But that relationship didn't last either. And then Belle met someone who would change her life, Sam Starr. Sam Starr was Cherokee. He was tall, slim, and came from the Starr family, which was well known in Indian Territory. And by well known, I mean they had a reputation. The Starr clan was known for being involved in various criminal activities, horse stealing, whiskey smuggling, general lawlessness. They weren't the kind of family you wanted your daughter to marry if you were hoping for respectability. But Sam Starr had something that Belle's previous relationships hadn't offered. He had land. As a Cherokee citizen, Sam had an allotment, 62 acres on the north side of the Canadian River, near a place called Briartown. This was real property, secure tenure, a place to call home. On June 5, 1880, Belle Shirley Reed married Sam Starr in a Cherokee ceremony. She was 32 years old, and for the first time in years, maybe for the first time since leaving Missouri, Belle had stability. She had a home. She had land. She had a partner who understood the world she was living in. And she took Sam's last name. Myra Maybelle Shirley Reed became Belle Starr, the name that would echo through history. The ranch where Belle and Sam lived became known as Younger's Bend, named after the Younger brothers who were Belle's old friends from Missouri. And this is where the legend really starts to take shape, where myth and reality become almost impossible to separate without careful historical detective work. Because Younger's Bend became famous, or infamous depending on your perspective, as a hideout for outlaws. Now let me paint you an accurate picture of what this place actually was, because it's important. It wasn't some fortress. It wasn't a headquarters for a sophisticated criminal empire. It wasn't anything like what the movies would have you believe. It was a log cabin, maybe a couple of outbuildings, 62 acres of land in a remote part of Indian Territory near the Canadian River. Isolated, hard to reach, no close neighbors. That was Younger's Bend. But it was a place where outlaws felt safe, and Belle and Sam did provide shelter to various criminals passing through. According to legend, Jesse James himself stayed there for several months at one point. Now, is that true? Maybe. Probably. Jesse James needed safe houses, and Belle had connections to his circle from way back in Missouri, so it's plausible that he stayed at Younger's Bend. There's even a story about how Belle described Jesse James's visit. She supposedly told Sam that a slim man with blinking blue eyes had come to visit. Sam was apparently suspicious of this cold, silent stranger, but Belle told him, "He's an old friend from Missouri." According to the story, Sam Starr never knew that the blinking, blue-eyed man was Jesse James, one of the most wanted outlaws in America. Now, is that story true? It could be. It has the kind of specific details that suggest it might be based on a real memory, or it could be embellished or even completely invented. We'll never know for sure, but it tells us something important whether it's true or not. Belle was connected to the most famous outlaws of her time. Whether she was actively running a criminal enterprise or just providing hospitality to old friends and associates, she was part of that outlaw world. Okay, this is where we really need to get honest about something, because this is at the heart of the Belle Starr legend. The myth, the story that was sold in those dime novels and portrayed in movies, says that Belle was the mastermind, that she was the brains behind the operation, that Sam Starr and the other men provided the muscle. But Belle planned the robberies, chose the targets, managed the money, ran the whole criminal enterprise. The sensational accounts claim she personally robbed banks and stagecoaches. They said she led a gang of 25 men. They portrayed her as being as dangerous as any man on the frontier, maybe more dangerous because she was smart and ruthless. So let's talk about what we actually know, what's documented, what's real. Here's what we know for certain from court records, testimony, and historical documentation. Belle and Sam Starr made money from criminal activity. They stole horses, they rustled cattle, they sold bootleg whiskey to Native Americans, which was illegal under federal law. And they provided shelter to wanted men, probably charging fees for that service. That's documented. That's real. Those things happen. But did Belle mastermind bank robberies? Was she a criminal genius planning elaborate heists like some kind of Old West criminal mastermind? There is no evidence for that. None. Zero. Despite decades of legends and stories, there's no documentary evidence, no court records, no credible testimony that Belle Starr planned or participated in bank robberies or major criminal enterprises beyond horse theft, cattle rustling, and harboring fugitives. What seems more likely, based on what historians have been able to piece together, is that Belle and Sam worked together as partners. They were probably both involved in planning and executing their crimes. But the crimes were relatively small scale. Horse theft, taking a few horses at a time and selling them. Cattle rustling, The same thing with cattle, bootlegging, buying whiskey and selling it illegally, harboring fugitives, letting wanted men stay at Younger's Bend in exchange for money. These were crimes, definitely. They were illegal, and if caught, Belle and Sam could face serious consequences. But they weren't the glamorous, dramatic outlaw adventures that the legends describe. They were more mundane, more practical, more about making money to survive than about dramatic holdups and shootouts. And here's another thing we know about Belle. She was apparently pretty good at working the system. When members of their criminal circle got arrested, Belle would allegedly use money to bribe officials to secure their release. And if bribery didn't work, some historical accounts claim she would use what they called her womanly charms on lawmen to get her friends released. Now I'm putting that in quotes, womanly charms, because that's how it was described in historical accounts from that era. And we need to be skeptical of descriptions like that. They tell us as much about the sexism and assumptions of the time as they do about what Belle actually did. But it does suggest something important. Belle was clever. She understood how to work within and around the legal system. She understood that there were tools available to her, money, connections, persuasion, that she could use to protect herself and her associates. She was strategic. That much is clear. Whether she was the criminal mastermind of legend or just a smart woman navigating a difficult situation, she knew how to work the angles. All right, here we are. The moment we've been building to, the one crime Belle Starr was actually convicted of in her entire life. This matters so much because it's the only time Belle Starr was actually found guilty of anything in a court of law. In 1883, Belle and Sam Starr were arrested and charged with horse theft. Now, the details of this case are important. They were accused of stealing a horse that belonged to a man who'd sold it to them. The legal situation was complicated. They'd bought the horse, paid money for it, but it turned out the horse had been stolen before they bought it. So were they guilty of horse theft if they'd bought a stolen horse without knowing it was stolen? Could they prove they didn't know? The case went to trial in Fort Smith, Arkansas, in the courtroom of Judge Isaac Parker. And if you know anything about the history of the Old West, that name should ring a bell. Judge Isaac Parker was famous, infamous really, as the hanging judge. He presided over the federal court that had jurisdiction over Indian Territory, and he was known for harsh, unforgiving sentences. During his 21 years on the bench, he sentenced 160 people to death. 79 of them were actually executed. So Belle and Sam were facing the hanging judge on a horse theft charge. In the Old West, horse theft was considered a very serious crime because horses were so valuable, so essential to survival. People who stole horses could face severe punishment. But here's where Belle's intelligence shows through again. She defended herself in court. She didn't have fancy lawyers. Either she couldn't afford them or chose not to use them. She represented herself. And by all contemporary accounts, she was articulate. She was clever. She presented her case well, arguing that she and Sam had bought the horse in good faith, that they hadn't known it was stolen. But it wasn't enough to convince Judge Parker and the jury. Belle and Sam Starr were found guilty of horse theft. Each was sentenced to 9 months in federal prison. Belle served her time at the Detroit House of Corrections in Michigan. Yes, Michigan, way up north, far from Indian Territory, far from everything Belle knew. That was probably deliberate, separating her from her support network and making it harder for her to maintain her connections. And here's something interesting. According to all accounts, Belle was a model prisoner. She followed the rules. She caused no trouble. She didn't try to escape or create problems. She just did her time quietly and waited for her release. 9 months later, in 1884, Belle was released. She made the long journey back to Indian Territory, back to Sam, back to Younger's Bend. And they went right back to their old life. Now, here's what's so significant about this conviction. This was it. This was Belle's only criminal conviction, one charge of horse theft, 9 months in prison. That's her entire documented criminal record. Not murder, not bank robbery, not armed robbery of stagecoaches, not leading a gang of 25 desperados on a crime spree across the frontier. Just one conviction for horse theft. So how did Belle Starr become the legendary Bandit Queen? How did one horse theft conviction turn into a reputation as one of the most dangerous women in the American West? Well, we're going to get to that. But first, we need to talk about what happened in the years after Belle got out of prison, because that's when things started to fall apart. Now, here's something really interesting that happened while Belle was in Fort Smith for her trial and imprisonment. A photographer took some pictures of her, and these photographs ended up being incredibly important to Belle's legend. One of the most famous images shows Belle standing there, wearing a man's hat, a dark velvet dress, her hands on her hips, with 2 pistols and holsters at her waist. She's looking directly at the camera with this defiant, almost challenging expression. It's a striking image. There's another famous photograph too. Belle standing with that outlaw named Blue Duck I mentioned earlier. Both of them are in handcuffs because they're in custody, but they're not looking defeated or ashamed. They're posed almost proudly, like being outlaws is something to be celebrated rather than hidden. These photographs did something really important. They made Belle Starr famous beyond just the local area. These pictures appeared in newspapers. People across the country saw them, and they saw a woman who looked nothing like what women were supposed to look like. Remember, this is the 1880s. Women were supposed to be modest, demure, domestic. They were supposed to wear proper ladies' clothing, keep their eyes downcast, defer to men. But here was Belle Starr, staring defiantly at the camera, wearing guns like a man, standing proud despite being under arrest. And Belle seemed to embrace this image. By all accounts, she had a flair for drama. She cultivated a particular look. She didn't dress like other frontier women. She wore those black velvet riding habits that made her stand out. She wore elaborate hats with ostrich plumes, expensive, attention-getting headwear. She carried those pearl-handled pistols openly, making sure everyone knew she was armed. She rode side saddle, which was the proper, ladylike way for a woman to ride. But she did it while dressed like a bandit, while carrying guns, while going places proper ladies weren't supposed to go. She was mixing symbols of femininity with symbols of masculine power and danger. Belle was creating a public image. Whether she was doing it consciously or it just came naturally to her, she was playing a role, crafting a persona, and people were fascinated by it. She was something different, something exciting, something that challenged all the rules about what women could be. But Belle's life was about to take another tragic turn, and this one would hit her hard. December 17, 1886, Sam Starr got into an argument with a man named Frank West. Frank West was actually Sam's cousin, and he was also a law officer. So this wasn't just a random dispute, it was personal, and it was between relatives. The argument escalated, tempers flared, and it turned into a gunfight. Both men drew their weapons, both men fired, and both men hit their targets. Sam Starr and Frank West both died of their gunshot wounds. Belle was widowed for the second time. She was 38 years old. Both of her husbands had died violently. Jim Reed murdered by his own gang, and now Sam Starr killed in a gunfight. And according to some historical accounts, Sam Starr had been the great love of Belle's life. Of all her relationships, this was the one where she seemed happiest, most settled, most like she'd found a real partnership. Now he was gone too, killed suddenly in a moment of anger, and Belle was alone again, in her late 30s, with a reputation that made it hard to build a conventional life, even if she'd wanted to. But Belle didn't stay alone for long, and her third and final marriage would be her most controversial. Belle's third husband was a man named Jim July. He was Cherokee, a relative of Sam Starr's, which is how Belle probably met him. And here's the thing that made people talk, that made this marriage scandalous. Jim July was 15 years younger than Belle. Think about that for a moment. Belle was 38 or 39 years old. Jim July was in his early 20s, maybe 23 or 24. Now, we need to be really honest about our own biases here and about the double standards of the time. If this had been a 38-year-old man marrying a 23-year-old woman, nobody in the 1880s would have blinked an eye. That happened all the time. Men routinely married women much younger than themselves, and it was considered completely normal, even expected. But a woman marrying a man 15 years younger? That was scandalous. It was seen as inappropriate, unseemly. There were implications about why a younger man would marry an older woman. Was she too rich, too powerful for him to refuse? Was he after her property? Was she desperate for companionship? The gossip must have been intense. Belle didn't care. Or if she did care, she married Jim July anyway. And he took the last name Starr, becoming Jim July Starr. They lived together at Younger's Bend, continuing the life Belle had built there. But by all accounts, this marriage was troubled. They fought constantly. Some accounts describe the relationship as stormy and particularly violent. Jim July was young, probably immature, maybe resented being in Belle's shadow. Belle was set in her ways, independent, not willing to play the submissive wife. The age difference probably mattered more than either of them expected. Unlike with Sam Starr, there don't seem to have been real affection and partnership holding this marriage together. It was troubled from the start, and it would end in the worst way possible. Somewhere during these years in Indian Territory, we're not exactly sure when, Belle allegedly made a statement to a reporter that became one of her most famous quotes. When asked about her associations with outlaws, about her lifestyle, about her choices, she supposedly said, "I am a friend to any brave and gallant outlaw." Now, did she actually say this? It's been quoted so many times in so many sources that it's taken on a life of its own. It's possible she said it. It's also possible a reporter invented it or embellished something she said. We'll never know for sure. But whether Belle actually spoke these words or not, they capture something important about her public persona. She wasn't ashamed of her associations. She wasn't trying to pretend to be respectable. She wasn't apologizing for her life choices or her relationships. Belle had embraced being an outsider. She leaned into the outlaw image. And that attitude, that defiance, that refusal to apologize or conform, that's part of what made her fascinating to people then and continues to make her interesting now. In the last years of Belle's life, her children were following troubled paths of their own. Remember, Belle had left her children with her mother to raise years earlier. She'd seen them occasionally, but hadn't been a constant presence in their lives, and both of them ended up in difficult situations. Her daughter Pearl, Rosie Lee, born in 1868, so she was now in her early 20s by the late 1880s, Pearl reportedly became a prostitute. Now, we need to be careful here about judgment and about understanding the limited options available to women in that era, especially women with damaged reputations because of their family connections. Some accounts say Pearl specifically chose this path to raise money to help her brother Eddie, who was in serious legal trouble. If that's true, it shows a kind of desperate family loyalty, a willingness to sacrifice for her brother even at great personal cost. And Eddie Reed, Belle's son, he'd been convicted of horse theft and receiving stolen property in July 1889. Judge Parker, yes, the same Judge Isaac Parker who'd sentenced Belle to prison, sent Eddie to prison in Columbus, Ohio. Belle's son was following in the family tradition of crime, whether she'd wanted that for him or not. Pearl eventually managed to secure a presidential pardon for Eddie in 1893, several years after Belle's death. But by then, the damage was done. Both of Belle's children had been marked by their mother's reputation, by their father's criminal activities, by the choices that had been made before they were even old enough to understand them. So in early 1889, Belle's life was complicated. Her marriage to Jim July was troubled. Her children were struggling. Her reputation was fixed. She was known as an outlaw, as Belle Starr, the Bandit Queen. Whether that was accurate or not, she was 40 years old, living in Indian Territory, trying to maintain her hold on Younger's Bend, trying to survive in a world that was changing around her. And then on February 3rd, 1889, 2 days before her 41st birthday, someone killed her. Part 3, The Murder and Unsolved Mystery. Let's reconstruct what happened on that day, February 3rd, 1889. We know some things for certain because they're documented in contemporary accounts. Other details we have to piece together from witness statements and physical evidence. It's a Saturday. Belle has been at a neighbor's house. Some accounts say it was to help with something. Others just say she was visiting. As the afternoon wears on and evening approaches, Belle decides to head home to Younger's Bend. She's alone. She mounts her horse and starts down the dirt road that leads back to her ranch. The road is isolated. There are woods on either side in some places, open areas in others. It's getting toward dusk, that time of day when the light is fading, but it's not quite dark yet. Belle is riding at a normal pace. She has no reason to think anything is wrong. And then suddenly, the first shotgun blast comes from behind her. It hits Belle in the back. The force of it knocks her from her horse or causes the startled horse to throw her. She falls to the ground. Now she's down, wounded, probably in shock and pain. Her horse has probably bolted, and the killer approaches her. They're not taking any chances. They fire again. This shot hits Belle in the back of the neck, in the shoulder, and in her face. Belle Starr dies there on that lonely road, just 2 days before her 41st birthday. The killer leaves. No witnesses see them. No one hears the shots or comes to investigate immediately. Eventually, we don't know exactly how long later, neighbors find Belle's body and carry her back to Younger's Bend. Let me tell you what the physical evidence tells us, because this matters for understanding what happened and potentially who did it. Belle died from multiple shotgun wounds. The first shot hit her from behind, in the back, the neck, and shoulder area. The second shot, fired when she was already on the ground, hit her in the face and neck area. The wounds were consistent with a shotgun, probably a double-barrel shotgun, fired from fairly close range. Now, legend has it that Belle was killed with her own double-barrel shotgun, that the killer somehow got hold of Belle's gun and used it against her. But that detail isn't confirmed in official records. It might be true, or it might be another embellishment added to make the story more dramatic. What we know for certain is that it was a shotgun. The pellet wounds and the pattern of injury are consistent with that type of weapon. And the fact that the killer approached and fired a second shot tells us something important. This wasn't just a random shooting or an accident. This was deliberate. Someone wanted to make sure Belle Starr was dead. And here's what's also significant. There were no witnesses. None. In a sparsely populated area like that part of Indian Territory, that wasn't necessarily unusual, but it meant that from the very start, this case was going to be difficult to solve. No witnesses. No one saw anyone riding away from the scene. No one heard Belle cry out or call for help. All investigators had to work with was a dead body with shotgun wounds, a roughly identified location, and the knowledge that Belle had enemies who might have wanted her dead. Here's where we need to talk about why this case has never been solved. And it's not just because there were no witnesses, though that's part of it. There were systemic failures in the investigation, and some of those failures tell us something uncomfortable about how Belle's murder was viewed by authorities. First, the jurisdictional chaos I talked about earlier, that played a huge role. Belle was killed in Indian Territory, which meant complicated, overlapping jurisdictions. Was this a federal case? Did Cherokee law apply? Who had the authority to investigate? These questions probably slowed down any initial response. Second, The forensic capabilities of the time were extremely limited. This was 1889. There was no fingerprinting technology that wouldn't be widely used in criminal investigations for another couple of decades. There was no ballistics analysis. There was no crime scene photography in any systematic way. There was no autopsy, or at least not a detailed medical examination like we'd have today. Basically, all investigators could do was look at the scene, talk to people, and hope someone knew something or would confess. That's it. That was the extent of investigative technology in 1889 in Indian Territory. Third, and this is the uncomfortable part, Belle was a known criminal and a social outcast. She'd been convicted of horse theft. She was known to associate with outlaws. She'd had 3 husbands, 2 of whom died violently. She dressed oddly. She carried guns. She didn't conform to any of the expectations for women of her time, and that meant there was probably less pressure to solve her murder than there would have been if a respectable woman had been killed. There's no evidence that authorities worked very hard to find her killer. The investigation seems to have been perfunctory at best. Belle Starr was expendable in the eyes of the law. She was someone whose death didn't really matter to the people in power. That's a harsh thing to say, but it's probably true. Fourth, there was the code of silence in the outlaw community. If Belle's killer was someone from that world, no one was going to talk to authorities about it. Outlaws didn't cooperate with lawmen. It was a matter of survival and principle. So even if people knew or suspected who'd killed Belle, they weren't going to volunteer that information to federal marshals. And fifth, the sheer isolation and geography of the area worked against solving the crime. By the time any serious investigation could begin, if one ever really did, evidence would have degraded. Witnesses' memories would have faded. Suspects could have easily disappeared into the vast expanses of Indian Territory or fled to other states or territories. All of these factors combined meant that from the very beginning, this case was probably unsolvable, and it has remained unsolved for over 135 years. But let's do what investigators at the time apparently didn't do thoroughly. Let's examine each potential suspect, look at the evidence, and see if we can make sense of who might have killed Belle Starr. First up, Edgar Watson. And honestly, by conventional investigative standards, Edgar Watson is the strongest suspect. He had motive, he had means, he had opportunity, and he was actually tried for Belle's murder. Here's what we know about Edgar Watson. He was a tenant farmer who was renting land from Belle at Younger's Bend. But Watson had a secret. He was a fugitive. He was wanted for murder in Florida and had fled north to avoid prosecution. He'd assumed a false identity and was trying to start over in Indian Territory. Now somehow Belle discovered that Watson was wanted for murder in Florida. Maybe someone told her. Maybe Watson's wife let it slip. Maybe Belle just figured it out. However it happened, Belle confronted Watson about it. And according to accounts, Belle threatened to turn Watson into the authorities. She allegedly told him that the Florida authorities might be very interested to know where he was. For Watson, this was a disaster. If Belle reported him, he'd be arrested, sent back to Florida, tried for murder. He could be executed. So Watson had a very strong motive to silence Belle permanently. Watson also had means and opportunity. According to one account, Watson borrowed a shotgun from a neighbor on the day of Belle's murder, claiming he needed it to hunt wolves. He had access to the weapon used. He knew Belle's routines and routes. He knew when she'd be riding home alone. And after Belle's murder, Watson was acting suspiciously. Belle's husband, Jim July Starr, actually accused Watson of the murder. Watson was arrested and put on trial. But here's where the case falls apart. There was no physical evidence linking Watson to the crime scene. There were no witnesses who saw him near the location where Belle was killed. The case against him was entirely circumstantial. Yes, he had motive. Yes, he had means and opportunity. But could prosecutors prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he'd actually pulled the trigger? The jury said no. Watson was acquitted and released. The case against him simply wasn't strong enough for a conviction. Watson later moved back to Florida, and here's a disturbing postscript. In 1910, 21 years after Belle's murder, Edgar Watson was himself killed in a shootout in Florida. He never confessed to killing Belle Starr. We'll never know if he actually did it. But by the standards of criminal investigation, Edgar Watson remains the prime suspect. He's the person who had the clearest motive, the best opportunity, and who was actually charged with the crime. The second suspect is someone who makes us uncomfortable to even consider. Belle's own son, Eddie Reed. Eddie was 18 years old when his mother was killed, and there's a genuinely disturbing piece of evidence that points toward him. According to multiple accounts, Belle had recently beaten Eddie severely. Why? Because Eddie had mistreated her favorite horse. Belle loved her horses. That much is clear from all historical accounts. And she apparently caught Eddie being rough with one of her prized horses, maybe hitting it or riding it too hard. Belle's response was violent. She whipped Eddie hard enough that he had visible injuries. A local doctor, Jesse Mooney Jr., later told his family that Eddie had come to him to have his wounds treated. Eddie was covered in marks from the whipping, and he was furious. According to Dr. Mooney, Eddie said, and I'm quoting here, "I'm going to kill her for this." Now, young men say things in anger. Lots of people make threats they don't mean when they're hurt and furious. But when Eddie's mother turned up dead just days later, that threat took on new significance. Eddie knew Belle's routines. He knew when she'd be riding home alone. He had access to weapons, and he had a very fresh motive: rage over being beaten, humiliation, desire for revenge. But here's what complicates this theory. Matricide, a son killing his mother, is extremely rare. It happens, but it's one of the rarest forms of murder. Most people, even those who are furious with their mothers, don't cross that line. Also, Eddie was never seriously investigated for his mother's murder. Maybe authorities didn't take the threat seriously. Maybe they didn't know about it. Maybe they just couldn't imagine an 18-year-old killing his own mother. Eddie's life after his mother's death was troubled. He was convicted of horse theft later in 1889. He eventually became a deputy in Fort Smith, apparently trying to live on the right side of the law. But in 1896, just 7 years after his mother's death, Eddie was shot and killed in a saloon in Claremore, Oklahoma. He died young and violently, just like both of his parents. Did Eddie kill his mother? We'll never know. The evidence is circumstantial: an angry threat, a recent beating, opportunity. But there's no proof, and Eddie took whatever he knew to his grave. The third suspect is Belle's third husband, Jim July Starr. And this is where we need to talk about domestic violence and intimate partner homicide, because the statistics are sobering. Most women who are murdered are killed by intimate partners: husbands, boyfriends, ex-partners. Belle's marriage to Jim July was troubled. Multiple sources describe it as stormy. There were constant fights. The age difference created tensions. Belle was nearly 40. Jim July was in his early 20s. Belle was strong-willed and independent. Jim July was young and probably resented being in her shadow. Some accounts suggest there was violence in the relationship. Given what we know about the time period and the circumstances, that's plausible. Jim July had motive. He'd inherit Younger's Bend if Belle died. He had means, access to weapons. He had opportunity. He knew Belle's schedule and routines better than anyone. And here's something else. After Belle's death, Jim July was quick to accuse Edgar Watson of the murder. Really quick. Almost suspiciously quick. Was he genuinely trying to find his wife's killer? Or was he trying to deflect suspicion from himself? But here are the problems with Jim July as a suspect. He appeared genuinely grief-stricken after Belle's death, according to some accounts. Though, of course, murderers can fake grief. He cooperated with authorities, and there's no clear evidence that he benefited significantly from Belle's death. Also, Jim July himself was killed by a U.S. Marshal less than a year after Belle's death. He was shot by Deputy Marshal Bob Hutchins in January 1890. Jim July lingered for days before dying, and if there was a deathbed confession about killing Belle, it was never reported. So Jim July remains a possible suspect, particularly given the domestic violence angle and the statistical likelihood that Belle would be killed by an intimate partner. But like with the other suspects, there's no proof, no evidence that would hold up in court. The fourth suspect is Belle's daughter, Pearl, and I'm going to be honest with you, this theory seems to be mostly modern speculation. There's not a lot of contemporary evidence that Pearl was seriously considered as a suspect at the time, but some modern accounts suggest Pearl as a possibility, so let's examine it. The proposed motive? Belle had allegedly prevented Pearl from marrying a man she loved. Mother-daughter relationships can be fraught with conflict, especially when the mother is controlling or disapproving. Also, Pearl was working as a prostitute at this point, and there's speculation that Belle disapproved of this and that they fought about it. And there's always the inheritance angle. Pearl stood to inherit from her mother's death, though whether there was much to inherit is questionable. But here's the thing. There's almost no evidence supporting this theory. No contemporary accounts mention Pearl as a suspect. There's no documentation of threats or serious conflicts beyond normal family tensions. Pearl later spent money from her prostitution work to secure her brother's release from prison, which suggests at least some family loyalty. The Pearl is killer theory seems to be more about the appeal of a dramatic mother-daughter conflict than about actual evidence. I don't think this is a strong suspect at all. The fifth possibility isn't really a specific suspect, but a category. Someone from Belle's criminal past, someone she'd wronged, someone who held a grudge, someone who'd waited for the right opportunity for revenge. Belle had been involved with outlaws for over 20 years by 1889. She'd harbored fugitives. She'd been part of criminal circles. And in that world, betrayals and conflicts were common. Maybe she refused to help someone. Maybe she testified against someone or threatened to. Maybe she knew secrets that someone wanted to keep hidden. The problem with this theory is it's too vague. Without a specific suspect, without any evidence pointing to a particular person, it's just speculation. It's the unknown assailant theory, and it doesn't get us anywhere in terms of solving the case. But it is possible Belle's murder could have been committed by someone whose name is lost to history, someone whose motive died with them, someone we'll simply never identify. So we've looked at all the main suspects. We've examined the evidence, such as it is, and we're left with an unsolved mystery that's persisted for 135 years. Why couldn't this case be solved then? And why can't we solve it now? Let me give you my analysis as someone who spent a lot of time studying this case. I think Edgar Watson is the most likely killer based on the evidence we have. He had the strongest, clearest motive. He was actually tried for the crime. And his subsequent actions and life story suggest he was capable of violence. But I also think we'll never know for certain. The investigation at the time was inadequate. Too much time passed. Evidence was lost. Witnesses disappeared or died. And because Belle was seen as expendable, as someone whose death didn't really matter to the people in power, no one pushed hard enough to solve this case when it might have been solvable. Belle Starr's murder remains unsolved not because it was a perfect crime, but because no one in authority cared enough to solve it. She was a woman who'd rejected social norms. She was a convicted criminal. She was associated with outlaws. In the eyes of many people in 1889, Belle Starr got what was coming to her. That's harsh. That's uncomfortable, but it's probably true. Belle was buried at Younger's Bend, on her own land. Her daughter Pearl later erected a gravestone using money she'd earned working in a brothel in Fort Smith. The gravestone is marked with a bell, a star, and a horse, and it bears this epitaph: "Shed not for her the bitter tear, nor give the heart to vain regret. 'Tis but the casket that lies here, The gem that filled it sparkles yet. The grave was robbed and vandalized shortly after Belle's burial, but it's since been restored, and you can visit it today near Purim, Oklahoma. People still make the trip to see where Belle Starr is buried, to pay their respects or satisfy their curiosity about this legendary woman. But here's the thing about that gravestone and that epitaph. Pearl chose words suggesting that Belle's spirit, the gem, survives beyond the body. And in a way, she was right. Something did survive, but it wasn't Belle, not the real woman. What survived was the myth. And now we need to talk about how that myth was created, how it spread, and how it eventually became more powerful and more widely known than the truth ever was. Because understanding how Belle Starr became the Bandit Queen of legend is just as important as understanding who she really was. Stick with me. We're in the home stretch now. Part 4. The Myth-Making Machine, How Belle Became a Legend. All right, friends. This is where things get really interesting from a media literacy perspective. Because what happened after Belle's death is a masterclass in how myths get created and how sensationalism can completely overwhelm truth. Belle Starr died on February 3rd, 1889. Within days, her obituary appeared in major newspapers, including the New York Times. And even in that initial obituary, the exaggerations and lies had already started. The New York Times obituary, published on February the 6th, 1889, claimed that Belle had been arrested for murder or robbery 20 times, but had always escaped justice. That's completely false. Belle was convicted exactly once of horse theft. She was arrested a handful of other times but never prosecuted. She was never charged with murder. But the New York Times printed these lies anyway because they made for a better story. The obituary also claimed she'd married Cole Younger directly after the war. Also false. Cole Younger himself denied ever marrying Belle or even having a romance with her. But again, the truth didn't matter. The exciting story mattered. But the real myth-making machine hadn't even started yet. Enter Richard K. Fox. Fox was a publisher in New York City who ran the National Police Gazette, which was essentially the tabloid media of its day. It was sensationalist, lurid, focused on crime and scandal. Fox also published dime novels, cheaply produced books that sold for 10 or 25 cents, and told dramatic, usually highly fictionalized stories. Fox saw Belle Starr's obituary, and more importantly, he saw an opportunity. A female outlaw killed mysteriously just 2 days before her birthday? That was gold. That was a story he could sell. So in 1889, the same year Belle died, Fox published a book. It was titled, and this is quite a title, Belle Starr, the Bandit Queen, or the Female Jesse James, a full and authentic history of the dashing female highwayman. Notice that word, authentic. It's right there in the title, claiming this is authentic, real, truthful history. It was almost complete fiction. Fox's book about Belle Starr created entirely fictional journal entries, supposedly written by Belle herself. He invented a romantic backstory between Belle and Cole Younger, complete with passionate scenes and dramatic declarations of love. He fabricated crimes that Belle never committed, bank robberies, stagecoach holdups, daring escapes. He described her as leading a gang of 25 men. He portrayed her as a criminal mastermind who planned elaborate heists. He turned her into something she never was, a violent, dangerous, bloodthirsty criminal genius. Here's an actual quote from Fox's book. Just to give you a sense of the over-the-top writing, she was more amorous than Anthony's mistress, more relentless than Pharaoh's daughter, and braver than Joan of Arc. I mean, come on, that's not biography. That's not history. That's purple prose designed to sell books and make money. Fox was comparing Belle Starr to Cleopatra and Joan of Arc, two of the most famous women in history. The book sold thousands of copies at 25 cents each. It was a huge success for Fox. And here's the really problematic part. This book, this work of fiction labeled as authentic history, has been cited as a historical source for over a century. Biographies written decades later used Fox's book as a primary source, not realizing or not caring that most of it was made up. The lies in Fox's book spread. They were repeated in other books, in articles, in histories of the Old West. The myth he created became accepted as fact. So why did the Belle Starr myth stick? Why did people believe Fox's sensationalized version instead of the much more mundane truth? Let me give you several reasons, because this is important for understanding how myths work in general. First, the myth served everyone's purposes. Publishers like Fox made money from sensational stories. The public wanted exciting tales of the Wild West. Moralists could use Belle as a cautionary tale about what happens to women who reject traditional roles. Romantics could see her as a rebel heroine. Everyone got something from the myth. Second, Belle was dead. She couldn't correct the record. She couldn't sue for libel. She couldn't give interviews saying, "No, that's not what happened." Dead people make excellent subjects for mythology because they can't fight back. Third, the myth tapped into broader cultural anxieties and fascinations. This was the late 1800s, and America was changing rapidly. The frontier was closing. The Wild West was disappearing. Industrialization was transforming society. There was this nostalgia for a rougher, freer time that probably never really existed the way people imagined it. Belle Starr became a symbol of that disappearing world. She represented freedom, defiance, a rejection of civilization's constraints. People wanted her to be the Bandit Queen because it fit their ideas about the Old West. Fourth, the myth reflected attitudes about gender and women's roles. Belle Starr was fascinating precisely because she violated every rule about how women were supposed to behave. She wore pants. She carried guns. She married multiple times. She rejected domesticity. She was everything a woman wasn't supposed to be, and that made her either titillating or terrifying, depending on your perspective. For men who wanted to keep women in traditional roles, Belle was proof that women who stepped out of line became criminals and met bad ends. For women who chafed against restrictions, Belle was a fantasy of freedom, even if she paid a terrible price for it. Fifth, there's just something about the story structure that Fox created. Beautiful woman, tragic love affairs, violence, revenge, freedom, death. It's a powerful narrative arc. It's the stuff of novels and movies. The truth, horse theft, harboring fugitives, managing property in Indian territory, that's not as exciting. So the myth won. It spread. It took over. And for more than 100 years, the myth has been more widely known than the truth. And then Hollywood got involved, and things got even more divorced from reality. In 1941, 20th Century Fox, no relation to Richard K. Fox, by the way, released a major motion picture called simply Belle Starr. It starred Jean Tierney, who was beautiful, glamorous, and bore absolutely no physical resemblance to the real Belle Starr. The movie was a romantic Western. It portrayed Belle as a beautiful Southern belle whose family was destroyed by the Civil War, who turned to crime out of grief and rage, who had passionate romances with various outlaws who led daring raids and robberies. It was exciting, it was dramatic, and it made no pretense whatsoever to historical accuracy. The filmmakers openly admitted they were creating entertainment, not documentary. But here's the problem. Most people don't read the fine print. Most people who watched that movie came away thinking they'd learned something about the real Belle Starr. The film cemented in popular consciousness this image of Belle as a glamorous, dangerous woman who lived by her own rules and died young and tragic. And that movie wasn't the last one. There were other films in the 1960s and 70s. There were TV shows. There were more books, some trying to be historically accurate. others continuing the sensationalism. Each retelling added new invented details, took the story further from the truth. By the late 20th century, Belle Starr the myth had completely overwhelmed Belle Starr the person. Most people, if they knew the name at all, knew the Hollywood version, not the historical reality. But in recent decades, something important has happened. Serious historians have started to do the hard work of separating fact from fiction. They've gone back to primary sources, court records, census data, actual contemporary newspaper accounts instead of sensationalized biographies. They've applied modern historical methods to figure out what really happened versus what was invented. One of the first major attempts was Glenn Shirley's book, Belle Starr in Her Times, published in 1982. Shirley systematically examined the myths and compared them to documentary evidence. He concluded that Belle's actual crimes were relatively minor and that she was never the violent criminal mastermind portrayed in legend. More recently, historians like Michael Wallace and Dane Huckelbridge have published biographies that try to understand the real Belle Starr. Wallace describes Belle as a woman demonized for refusing to accept the genteel Victorian ideals expected of her. He argues she chose to live outside the law, but notes she, more than likely, never killed a single person. Huckelbridge's recent book, Queen of All Mayhem, explores the contradictions in Belle's life and asks important questions. Why would a woman with advantages, education, family connections, intelligence, choose a criminal path? How did trauma from the Civil War and from losing 2 husbands to violence shape her choices? These modern historians are doing important work. They're reclaiming Belle Starr from the myth and trying to understand her as a real, complex human being. They're not trying to make her a saint. She did commit crimes, she did make questionable choices, but they're also not accepting the sensationalized portrait of her as a violent criminal mastermind. They're trying to find the truth, and the truth, as I've tried to show you over the past 2 hours, is more interesting than the myth. So what does Belle Starr's story mean for us today? Why should we care about this woman who died 135 years ago? Let me suggest a few reasons. First, Belle's story is a cautionary tale about media literacy. It shows us how easily lies can become accepted as truth when they're repeated often enough, when they're profitable enough, when they serve people's needs and desires. Richard K. Fox created a myth in 1889, and that myth is still believed by many people today, despite being thoroughly debunked by historians. In our era of social media and viral misinformation, understanding how the Belle Starr myth was created and spread is more relevant than ever. False information spreads faster and farther than truth. Sensational stories get more attention than boring facts. These aren't new problems, they're old problems in new forms. Second, Belle's story is about the constraints women faced and the costs of breaking those constraints. Belle rejected Victorian ideas about how women should behave. She refused to be domestic, demure, submissive, and she paid a price for that rejection in her reputation, in her relationships, in her criminal record, and ultimately in her death. Now, we might not agree with all of Belle's choices. Stealing horses and harboring fugitives aren't admirable activities, but we can understand that Belle was operating in a world where women's options were extremely limited, where the respectable path had been closed off to her, and where survival sometimes meant making choices that were outside the law. Third, Belle's story reminds us that history is complicated and that people are complicated. Belle wasn't a saint and she wasn't a monster. She was a human being trying to survive in difficult circumstances, making choices that made sense to her, even if they don't make sense to us, navigating a world that gave her very few good options. Fourth, Belle's story shows us the importance of questioning what we've been told. For 100 years, people accepted the myth of Belle Starr without questioning it. It was only when historians started to dig deeper, to look at primary sources, to ask, is this actually true, that the myth started to crumble. That's a valuable lesson for all of us. Just because something is widely believed doesn't make it true. Just because it's been repeated many times doesn't make it accurate. We need to ask questions, examine evidence, and be willing to change our minds when the facts don't support what we thought we knew. We're coming to the end of our journey through Belle Starr's life and legend. But before we wrap up, I want to take a few minutes to really think about legacy and memory. What should we remember about Belle Starr? How should she be remembered? Let's talk about that in our closing segment. Friends, we've spent 2 hours together exploring the life, death, and legend of Belle Starr. We've separated truth from fiction. We've examined her crimes, her marriages, her choices. We've investigated her unsolved murder. And we've watched how a relatively minor horse thief became one of the most famous outlaws in American history. So let me leave you with some final thoughts and key takeaways. First takeaway, Belle Starr's greatest crime wasn't horse theft. It was being a woman who refused to disappear. She rejected the roles society wanted to assign her. She lived visibly, defiantly, on her own terms in a world that punished women for that kind of independence. And for that, she was turned into a monster in legend, made more dangerous and more criminal than she ever actually was. Second takeaway, myths are powerful, but truth matters. The Belle Starr myth served many people's purposes and made a lot of money for publishers and filmmakers. But it buried the real woman beneath layers of fiction, and it took serious historical work to uncover who Belle really was. We owe it to historical figures and to ourselves to seek truth, even when myths are more exciting. Third takeaway, Belle Starr's story is ultimately about survival and choice in a world with limited options. She wasn't a passive victim of circumstances, but she also wasn't operating with complete freedom. She was shaped by trauma, by loss, by the constraints of her time. Understanding her means understanding the world she lived in and the impossible choices women faced. If Belle Starr could speak to us from that grave at Younger's Bend, what would she want us to know? Maybe this, that she lived on her own terms in a world that punished women for independence, that she was smarter and more strategic than history gave her credit for, that she loved horses and hated being told what to do, that she survived 2 husbands' murders and kept going, that she served her time with dignity when convicted and went right back to the life she'd chosen. And maybe she'd want us to know that the truth about her life, the real truth, was always more interesting than any sensationalized story Richard K. Fox could invent. Thank you so much for spending these 2 hours with me, diving deep into Belle Starr's story. I hope you learned something new. I hope you'll think differently about legends and myths and how history gets written. And I hope Belle Starr feels a little more real to you now, a little more human, a little less like a cartoon character from a Western movie. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Crime Tales wherever you're listening. Leave us a review. It really does help other people find the show. And share this episode with someone who loves true crime or history or stories about fascinating, complicated women. Next time on Crime Tales, we're diving into another historical true crime case that'll surprise you. I won't spoil it, but trust me, you won't want to miss it. Until then, stay curious, question everything, and remember, the truth is always more interesting than the legend. This has been Crime Tales. I'm your host. Thanks for listening.